Hi, I'm Devin Stewart here at Carnegie Council in New York City. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Ian Bremmer. He is president of the Eurasia Group here in New York. And today we're speaking about his company's top 10 political risks around the world for 2019 and their ethical implications. Ian, so good to have you back for the 11th year in a row.
11 years.
11 years.
And
This is the second
apparently
decade.
last year, I saw from you
Yes.
that our podcast live stream was one of the most popular
That's right.
for the whole year for Carnegie. So people tell your friends.
Mostly about the socks, I think, though. So
The socks are always helpful.
we have to do a quick sock check.
Okay.
I wore special drum socks,
Yep.
bright red, drum set.
Do
Is
they
that up to par for you, or
very much up to par?
not as good as yours though?
My socks.
Any
I try to
stories?
never send a political message with my socks. This is the anti-Trudeau sock, right? Like I may have sock game, but I don't have sock message. I think that's very important.
You do have, well, according to social media, Ian's got serious sock game. So that's
Someone said it on
confirmed.
social media?
It
That,
did.
that sounds like a Russian troll. That really does.
So all day today, you've been talking about your fantastic book. You were there on Morning Joe this morning, talking about us versus them, the failure of globalism. It's an excellent book, and I think I'm going to ask you to sign this later on. The last time you and I talked, I think, was about this book. So how is your book holding up? It came out in April. How's it been received, and what is your what's the main message here?
Look, I'm surprised I'm talking about it, to be honest with you, because usually you do it for like your 4 weeks and and then it goes away, and it's coming back, and it's coming back, I think, in part just because people are getting more worried. When the book came out, for example, I think there was more of a belief that Angela Merkel was still kind of holding down the fort, and Macron, of course, had won in France and was quite popular. And I mean, it was clear to me, I think, that the structural factors that were supporting this rise of populism, nationalism across democracies all over the world was not going to go away. But I think there was a hope on the part of the foreign policy establishment and a lot of elites that maybe we had seen the high peak, that the wave had crested. And now you have Merkel having stepped down and Macron at 23% approval, and sort of massive demonstrations on the streets. And meanwhile, you see the wheels continue to wobble more sharply in the United States. And yes, Trump got hit pretty hard in a proxy vote in the House in 2018.
Right.
But you also see that on the Democratic side, the real excitement is on the progressive left. It's the anti-establishment message. So it's pretty clear that
The progressive left is a kind of populist response? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in the sense that you see people going after the bankers, people going after the markets, people like, AOC here in New York, who, I mean, certainly is extraordinarily charismatic.
Just in initials, that's all you need.
But come from nowhere, right? Came from nowhere, suddenly has almost 2.5 million followers. I mean, dominating the interactions on social media in the last week more than anyone but Trump.
I think you tweeted that.
I did, and yet no one saw it compared to the people talking about AOC directly. You got to ride that wave. I mean, there's no question. Whether you like this or you don't like this is kind of irrelevant. The fact is, it's growing, and it's growing at a time when the global economy is doing well. I mean, there are good stories out there. There are Americans that were out of the market that are over 50 years old that are now coming back in. They're getting hired. They're getting retrained. Like, that's a great story.
That's the way it's supposed to work. That's how globalization is supposed to work. Right?
That's right.
There's supposed to be support for displacement.
For people that get displaced, whether it's from free trade or from robots taking your job, we have to have some level of responsibility for that. And yet, I would say larger and larger numbers of people in these economies, including our own, are increasingly feel forgotten and displaced. And so when there is, here's how the book relates to the top risks this year. It's a very simple thing, which is that if you and I look back at the last crises that were truly bolt from the blue, global crises, there are two. There was 9/11, and there was the 2008 financial crisis. People didn't see them coming. They were completely unexpected. They were very, very serious. But in response to both of those crises, we came together. Americans came together, Democrats and Republicans in Congress and presidents, and the world came together. Our allies supported us, and even not after 9/11, Russia supported us. After 2008 financial crisis, the Chinese supported us, right?
Right.
And I don't know what the next crisis is. I don't know if it's Ebola spreading from the DRC or it's another Russian major cyber attack that gets much bigger. I don't know if it's another major terrorist attack, or perhaps most likely if it's some other major global economic downturn. But what I know is that the politics are nowhere close to the level of resilience we had after 9/11, 2008. Our ability to come together at home or internationally just isn't there. And it's getting worse. It's getting worse all through 2019, and that should unnerve us.
So it's become more fragile.
Vastly more fragile.
And that's what we're going to get to later on, what you're calling bad seeds.
Bad seeds.
Like I think there's a band, the bad seeds, maybe.
Is there?
I think so.
Really?
You got to look that up.
I didn't
Gotta look
know
that up.
I bet it's Japanese. The best. You would know that because
I
you
should-
have
I
you
should
are
know
a
that.
closet Japan hand.
And also out of the closet, too. Yeah.
I didn't want to tell everyone.
It's
The socks should be obvious
It's
from
cool.
the socks.
It's cool to be
Yeah.
a Japan guy these days.
It is. I think it's increasingly. It should be because Japan. Let's face it. Japan
Yeah.
is the one country among the advanced industrial democracies that is not facing this problem at all.
Well, you're two kind of not gloomy, but they can be related to political risk. Your two big concepts are us versus them, which is sort of this primordial competitiveness, right? I would describe it that way. And then your other one, you've named your media company after, is G0, which is a kind of apolarity in international politics. It's a politics of self-help rather than cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
So you have G0 and you have us versus them. I think that those two things pretty much capture where we are in 2019 today.
That's right.
Is this situation inherently unstable, or can you have a sort of realpolitik peace?
No, I'm really glad that you asked it that way, because think about it. The G0 is about the unwind of the global order top down, right? U.S.-led global order, and now you see these pieces pulling apart. And the most important piece of that, of course, the most disruptive being the rise of China. And the rise of China with a different model, right? And you and I have talked about that many times over the past 11 years.
Yeah, major theme.
The second piece is inside the advanced industrial democracies in particular, the us versus them that is eroding the legitimacy of these leaders, the institutions, and all the rest. Now, it's the reason why it is important to look at both sides of that coin is because the resolution of those problems drives you in different directions. Right? So, because if you want to respond to the G0, what do you need? You need
Cooperation.
stronger Europe.
Right.
You need stronger multilateral cooperation. You need, more American commitment to allies.
Alliances,
You need
yep.
TPP. You need all this kind of stuff.
Big projects.
Right. And yet, those are exactly the things that you can't do when you have this rising populism, nationalism saying, you guys are selling us out to the globalists, and that's no good. And we want closed borders. We want tariffs and an end to free trade, even on the technology front. Like, you can see the tensions between saying, well, if we want to beat on the Chinese, we need industrial policy to support these big tech companies as our most strategic sector. But if you're talking about us versus them, it's populist techlash against these corporations that are undermining democracy. So it makes it so much harder. So at least after 9/11, right, we knew what we were doing. We were all fighting Al-Qaeda. After 2008, we knew what we were doing. We're all trying to get out of this economic recession. When you've got us versus them and the G0, your responses are pulling you in two completely different directions. And let's face it, the people that are talking about the geopolitical disorder are not the same people that are talking about the populist nationalist problem.
Right, they're missing half the equation.
They're two completely different constituencies.
Yep.
Yeah.
Before we get to your report, which we'll do very quickly, we're now at the midpoint of the Trump administration, right? So let's do maybe a quick review, what you think. What kind of grade would you give him? And do you see any kind of norms being displayed? We're at Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. Are there values to this administration? I know that he talks about reciprocity a lot. That's one of his favorite words, apparently. Do you see that, and does Trump sort of have do you see a strategy emerging in foreign policy?
I mean, reciprocity is hard because he obviously believes that rules do not apply to him, right?
Right.
So he's one of the least reciprocal leaders I personally have ever encountered. I do believe that transactionalism, I do believe unilateralism. I think that, I've said before that I feel like his foreign policy is very Chinese in many ways. It's not long-term and strategic, but it's certainly like he doesn't care about the human rights. He doesn't care about the sovereignty really matters to him. He doesn't want to be constrained by multilateralism. He's the big guy, so he wants to be one-on-one deal-making. That's the way the Chinese heretofore have actually done a lot of their foreign policy. And what kind of a grade do I give them? The cheap thing to say is incomplete.
Midterm exams.
The cheap thing to say is incomplete, absent
But you're not
for
cheap.
a lot of stuff. I can be cheap. So the mainstream media gives him an F minus, right? I mean, Rachel Maddow every night going, "Oh my God!"
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
It's
the hair is
exhausting.
on fire.
Exhausting.
And it's exhausting. And I think it is more interesting to recognize that there are two very different ways to grade Trump. The first way to grade Trump is to understand that his actual policy impacts are both pretty aligned with what Republicans in many cases historically would have argued for domestically.
Sure.
His judicial appointments, his Fed appointments, his regulatory rollback, his selective enforcement, his tax
cuts,
policy, all of this stuff, right? And on foreign policy, he's talked a huge game,
Right.
and the needle just hasn't moved much.
Not
I mean,
much,
he's left Paris, the climate accord, but actually you can't physically leave until 2021. So if he doesn't win a second term, nothing happens. And most of them, the key American constituents, are still adhering to it anyway. He pulled out of TPP, but everyone else that was in TPP actually still did the deal. So a future American president go in. He pulled out of the Iranian deal, but the Iranians are still holding up their end of the bargain, as is everyone else, and they're trying to run out the clock on what they hope will be a one-term Trump deal. So, I mean, Pompeo will tell you privately that if he doesn't get a second term, his Iran policy fails.
Right.
What else? You can look at NAFTA,
Yeah.
which he says is the worst deal ever, and he ends up doing a deal that's a slight improvement at the margins from what NAFTA used to be. He talks big on fire and fury with North Korea. Now we're
Right.
going to have a second summit. And
Right.
incrementally, actually, North Korea is behaving a little better than they used to.
Sure.
But there's no real movement there. So you look at that and you say, what the hell are these people talking about on the media? Like, this is just, there's not much there.
I agree.
But then you look at the erosion of U.S. leadership and in the global order and the lack of capacity to respond to Belt and Road,
Right.
which was already happening under Bush, already happening under Obama a little more, but now is happening much more under Trump, right? Because leaders around the world do not trust the United States as much, and clearly Trump is partially responsible for that. So if you're going to grade him on leading by example, if you were going to grade him on some kind of defensive measure to try to prevent the G0 from becoming as nasty and dangerous as it can be, reducing and responding to the geopolitical recession, on that front, you give him an F.
Yeah.
On that front, you give him an F. But on the, on the actual policies being implemented and the talk big and all the, I just don't think it's remarkable.
So tepid.
Tepid and on a couple things. Again,
Yeah.
if you ask me about where we are with South Korea on trade right now, marginal improvement. Where we are with North Korea, marginal improvement. Where we are with NAFTA, marginal improvement. Where we are with NATO, other countries starting to spend a little bit more, marginal improvement. So, maybe even a bit more than tepid.
Right.
Even a bit more, though he's broken some other stuff. After bad start on Yemen, for example, now that Mohammed bin Salman has been, sort of really clipped back, we have a ceasefire in the port of Hodeidah, which the U.S. has actually been useful on. Now, Trump's public talk about MBS has been appalling and atrocious. But, and he was the guy that moved the the embassy to Jerusalem, and
Right.
the Israelis really like that. Everyone said it's going to be a disaster. What was the impact of it? I mean, the Brazilians doing the same thing.
Crickets.
Zero crickets. So I mean, it's hard for me to get that worked up on the policy side, but on you take it one big step back and look at where the world is heading. And again, you and I have been talking about how we are heading into a very black geopolitical period. Trump is not helping that.
Yeah.
Trump is hurting that. That is true.
Well, let's get right into the 2019 top risks report. The new report starts by saying the geopolitical environment is the most dangerous in decades, yet
Yes.
the global economy is pretty good, the markets are up and down, not too bad, and a lot of your risks are not urgent.
Right.
So, as you said in your report, what is wrong with this picture? So, can you answer your own question? What is wrong with that picture? Nothing?
Not much is wrong with that picture if you're looking at 2019. I mean, so here's the interesting thing, is that we've been doing this. I started Eurasia Group back in 1998, so we've been doing this work for a long time now.
21 years.
And yet when you put out a top risk report and you launch it, and everyone's talking to you about it, and it's a big deal. You have this big platform, right? And you want to tell people what you think the state of the world is. And yet, 2019 is this artificial 12-month period.
Completely arbitrary.
I could have very easily presented the report and just said, guys, this is a pretty good year.
Yeah.
But you and I know, and the people watching us right now know, that geopolitically, not only are things not good, but they're heading in a direction that is more problematic than any in our lifetimes. And so for us not to talk about that, I think it is absolutely rational that the markets are not pricing this in particularly. Because I don't think in the near foreseeable future that we are heading for this kind of a disaster. There should be some hedging. There should be some risk-off behavior, as they say in the markets. There definitely are some concerns around U.S.-China trade near term, though I don't think it will blow up at all. There are other things like that.
Right.
But the long term, as I mentioned before, the resilience.
Right.
This is not sustainable. Like right now, the geopolitical order is heading for cyber war, trade war, tech war, war, right? I mean, we are. And at some point, we have to start fixing these things, or a lot of people are going to die. I mean, that's really what it amounts to.
And that's,
the word this year was geopolitical climate change.
Climate change.
Yeah.
You want to explain that now?
You can, doesn't matter.
So, well, I think you better explain it because you came up with it.
Well, okay.
So it's another, my interpretation of geopolitical climate change is it's a risk that's inevitably going to come, but it's very difficult to harness a sort of a collective action, if you will. Right?
It is very hard to harness collective action, and yet the science is very clear.
Right.
In other words, 30, 40 years ago, you go and talk to climatologists, there was not a lot of uncertainty that climate change was happening. There were uncertainty on details, on speed, but everyone recognized that if we don't address this, a lot of people are going to die. It's going to be a very suboptimal outcome for the world. And yet, because of the collective action problem that you just talked about, here we are.
Here we are.
And look at insurance companies, and look at Bangladesh, and look at the Maldives, and all of these things that were utterly predictable. You didn't need a crystal ball. We are now experiencing that geopolitically. The major problem is that geopolitics, we're not talking about 30 years like climate change, more like 30 months, right? Like, this isn't going to last 30 years, right? Wheels are going to come off before then. And it is really obvious that we've got a collective action problem. We can't respond to it effectively. We won't respond to it effectively. So it's going to get worse before we start to really address the issue.
Well, we're going to start at risk 5 and count up to the top. Right? Up to the top, not down. It's not a countdown. So counting up, the risk number 5 is the United States at home. So for the first time, your report has U.S. domestic politics on the list of top risks.
Never before, yeah.
So what do you think is sort of in the realm of the possible in terms of worst case, in between possible and worst?
Because last year it was a red herring.
Right.
The U.S. at home. We said no matter what Trump does.
You were correct, Bob.
Absolutely, that was on target. And again, a lot of people didn't like that because people say, what do you mean? How can Trump be a red herring? Look at all the horrible things.
Yeah.
This year he makes the list.
Okay.
But
Is he
he's
happy
number
about that?
5. Well, the Trump puppet was not happy.
I saw that.
The Trump puppet was like, "I'm number one. How can you call me number 5?"
The greatest risk ever.
Greatest risk ever was Trump, and Mexico is going to pay for that risk. Mexico's going to pay for that risk. I did not have a Trump puppet last year. That is one of the big kind of improvements in our top risks.
It's a major investment.
Major investment. These puppets are like $8,000 each.
Capital
They're expensive,
expenditure.
and they got like you need people to man them and everything, and it's crazy.
Good for you guys.
Yeah. So, but everyone should have a Trump puppet. I believe it's
A Trump puppet in every pot.
in every pot. A Trump puppet in every pot. It's like a boiling frog. And you don't even notice it, right? Because no one shoots the frog in the head. As Preet Bharara said the other day, said the thing about that analogy is you don't notice your boiling frog because no one shoots the frog in the head. I never heard anyone talk about shooting the frog in the head before. Yeah.
It's pretty graphic.
It's graphic. Because if someone shot, you had a frog in a pot, someone comes up and shoots the frog in the head,
very loud.
People be like, "Oh my God, they shot the frog." But if you simmer the frog,
he jumps out.
he doesn't jump. That's the whole point.
It's a myth, isn't it?
It's a myth.
I think that's a myth.
I think it depends on whether you have it on saute or whether you have it on full on. You have it on full on, he probably jumps out. He's like, "Screw this."
I think
What are we talking about? Number 5 still?
We could talk about number 4.
Oh no, we haven't talked about number 5 yet, though.
Do we want to talk about more about? Okay, so I thought Trump in every pot was.
Yeah, no.
So
What could happen?
What could happen? Yeah.
The reason it's number 5, and it does really matter, is because this is the year that the investigation reports come out, not just Mueller, but also here in New York and others, and they're going to go after Trump's organization, his family, and his person. And we know that Trump's response to that is going to be escalation. So I think we have to be honest that American political institutions will be tested as they have never been tested before in our lifetimes. I believe that they will stand up, or mostly stand up to that test.
Okay.
Which is why this is only risk number 5 and not number 2 or number 1, right? I don't think the U.S. comes out of 2019 looking like Hungary. But we have to recognize that there is a danger. We have to recognize that Trump has the potential to try to use American institutions in ways that would exceed traditional norms of executive power, and that to some degree the media, Congress, even the judiciary comes out damaged. And that is I think what the risk is.
But so far they've been resilient. They've been standing
completely.
up. Okay.
Completely, but they've not been tested the way they will be in 2019.
Got
so
it.
I think we have to be honest with the audience that it's a real risk.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you mentioned Hungary, so that actually is a good
Plays into
segue
number
to
4,
number 4,
actually,
right?
yeah.
So, because I think I just read this biography of Orban in
Viktor
the
Orban.
New Yorker magazine.
Yep.
And they're talking about how his party would like to sort of reinvent itself as Christian Democrats. Sounds really nice, right? Your risk number 4 is European populism. Your report says 2019 will show that populists and protest movements are stronger than ever. So my question is, which countries are you worried about? I suppose Hungary, maybe Italy, perhaps Germany is on the list. But which countries, and what do these populist parties want?
In 2019, I'm actually not very worried about individual European countries. Again, we're out of recession.
Okay.
Wheels aren't falling off. Macron has a lot of problems, but you're not getting rid of him, and he does actually have all the power in France as the president in a way that, say, the UK prime minister is just elected directly by his own constituency. In the United States, you've got Congress separate from the executive. In France, it all does kind of come together, so there's a lot more opposition to him, which is interesting to think about. But no, the problem in Europe is this year we have European parliamentary elections. And the European Parliament, we think the populists are set to get almost 40% total in that vote, which is a huge pickup from where they were before, which means the European Parliament and the bureaucrats are suddenly going to be really divided between pro-Europe and Eurosceptic. And that is yet one more thing that makes Europe less relevant, harder to manage, harder to govern, harder to respond to the next crisis when it hits, harder to be an effective partner with the United States when we're ready to be an effective partner ourselves, harder to negotiate effectively with Brexit as it goes through. That's the single biggest thing in 2019. Though, I mean, you have the Italians with the challenging negotiations with Brussels on budget. You have the French now massively shooting through their fiscal constraints, and that undermines the ability to do better governance and fiscal consolidation.
So it's mostly weakening Europe.
It's mostly weakening Europe on the back of this continuing expansion of populism. Yeah.
And what do you
less
make,
worried about Germany, by the way?
So going back to Orban and Hungary.
Yeah.
it gets to your themes of us versus them and a G0 world. What do you make of, how do you assess the argument, the sort of intellectual and moral argument that these parties want to defend Christian traditions or European traditions? How do you sort of pick that apart? What do you make of it? Does it have validity?
It's interesting that there isn't a question that deserves to be discussed as to whether the tribalism, the ethno-nationalism, and the religious nationalism, that the reactionary right, the populist right embraces to get the support of the disenfranchised, is that somehow more attractive and more powerful than the class identity politics from the populist left, right? Is it stickier? Is it easier to pick up the disenfranchised? I mean, certainly, Marx and Lenin ultimately figured that out, right? Like, it's hard to get the proletarians of the world to actually unite. They fly under their more tribal flags when they get really pissed off. But, there has been third way politics in Europe. Syriza has been, the biggest pickup opportunistically from what was a real depression in Greece that they're still going through. And that's not Eurosceptic at all. It's pro-Europe, it's pro-Euro, and it's working within existing institutions. Podemos in Spain, same thing. And, even though Trump is president in the United States, we mentioned AOC already. You'd look at Bernie Sanders. I mean, Bernie could be president if it wasn't for the fact that the Democratic leadership controlled the nomination process of what was a very opaque and non-democratic process, right? Yeah. So, I mean, it's unclear to me how much we want to rest on the argument that people are getting really pissed off in democracies and therefore the far right is going to be the unique beneficiary. It's not clear to me, but I think that needs data. That needs more exploration. I am certainly sympathetic to a lot of people that feel like the system has been rigged against them, turning to people that promise that they're going to break those vested elites. I'm not very sympathetic to Christian nationalism, especially because, let's face it, so much of, I like separation of church and state. I like a more ecumenical view. I happen to be a Christian. I happen to believe in God. But my view of what God is pretty ecumenical. And I really don't like it when other people tell me that their view of God is better than mine. And I expect that that is true of most people.
You should be a Unitarian.
Yeah, no, I like more smells and bells than Unitarians. And I was raised Catholic, so I have a little bit of pushback personally. But I think that we'd be better off, right, if more governments recognize that Unitarianism is safer, right? You just don't want to govern people with strong religious beliefs because it's too exclusionary, it's problematic. And the Hungarians are, let's face it, it's great if you're us, it sucks if you're them. And that's why has Trump done so well with his base. He does so well with his base because he tells you that they are bad.
Right.
And that our country will not be, we won't even recognize our country if we can't build a wall. Why? To keep them out, right? That's a strong message. It's not one I happen to embrace, but it's a strong message.
What was his tweet? Something about the country you will not even recognize, or something?
Will be unrecognizable.
Unrecognizable.
Something like that.
Yeah.
I don't memorize the tweets when they come out. They just pass over. They wash over.
Good. That's the correct attitude.
That's the correct attitude.
So risk number 3, Ian, is also a threat to probably the future of democracies, I suppose. That's cyber gloves off. Hackers have grown more sophisticated while societies have become heavily dependent on digital services. Yeah. So which countries are you concerned about, and what are the goals of using this technique in statecraft?
It's both statecraft and non-statecraft.
Right.
A lot of non-state actors also developing more capabilities on cyber. A lot of state actors that we don't think of as very powerful, nonetheless have robust cyber capabilities. North Korea, Iran, certainly. The biggest danger has to be Russia, because they are not only largely at parity with the United States in offensive capabilities, but they're also very risk acceptant, and they are led by one guy.
Right.
So when I see the Americans starting to think about a more robust cyber deterrent that could even lead to preemptive strikes against bad actors, for me that doesn't mean deterrence is coming. That means dangers of escalation are growing. When I see the Mueller investigation coming down and largely and probably going to finger a lot of individuals that are just one or two people from Putin, I say, wow, they could react against that.
Yeah.
And those are cyber attacks that could hit us and hit our critical infrastructure. So I do think that the tail risks of sudden cyber attacks, even in a year like 2019 where the political risk environment is not actually that problematic, that's one that I would focus on.
Are you of the school of thought like Yuval Harari, who points to artificial intelligence as potentially one of the most dangerous threats in the future to democracy?
Sure.
You're in agreement with that?
Yeah.
You mentioned that last year. That's why I bring it up.
Yeah. And I mean, certainly, I've read Homo Deus and
Right.
his most recent essays, which aren't as interesting, but he's a brilliant guy. Obviously, he gives a lot of thought to these issues. I think that when you talk about artificial intelligence, when you talk about algorithms that you are developing that clearly are coming up with answers from pattern recognition and deep learning that are correct, but that we don't understand.
Right.
So, for example, the ability of AI to identify physical features that determine your sexual preference is vastly greater than any human being on the planet, and yet we don't know how AI does it. Like, we don't know what it is.
Right.
When you unleash technologies like that, you clearly facilitate bad actors, right? Because good action comes from thoughtfulness. As we say as political scientists, garbage in, garbage out.
Right.
If your model is putting in garbage data, you get garbage out. It's only when you have people, technology and science is value neutral.
Right.
And it needs custodians. It needs curators.
Yeah.
It needs people that ultimately care about humanity that are
Needs
running
restraint.
it. And it needs values.
Yeah.
And AI by itself is becoming more valueless because we as the human beings that are creating it increasingly don't understand it. Obviously, that is a fundamental threat to humanity.
Relates to risk number 2,
does.
which is U.S.-China. Your report says we remain concerned about the world's most important bilateral relationship.
Right.
You mentioned earlier in this interview that you're not too worried about the trade war going crazy.
Not this year.
So what area is the most dangerous between the U.S. and China?
I mean, it kind of what's most dangerous is that we are going to have on March 1 or thereabouts. March 1 is the deadline imposed by Trump. We're going to have some sort of announcement that says we've made huge progress between Xi Jinping and Trump, both for different reasons,
Right.
But aligned. We are going to say no move to 25% tariffs, and they're going to buy more American soybeans, and the trade deficit's not going to be as bad, and things are awesome. And yet, it's a bad patch job on a house that's falling down.
Right.
And what we know is that on every major structural issue, whether it's big architecture like One Belt, One Road, or whether it's Taiwan or the South China Sea or the East China Sea, or whether it's intellectual property and theft, or whether it's technology and AI and their treatment of those companies and American firms that can't invest in China, don't have access to the market, Chinese companies that are getting hit in the US, Huawei and all the rest, or the rollout of 5G. All of this are the two largest countries in the world coming to loggerheads. So again, 2019 doesn't necessarily feel, at least the beginning of 2019 is going to feel good, but it's going to become increasingly obvious that we are on a very dangerous path.
Ian, I'm sure you're well aware of a very new attitude in Washington, D.C. toward China.
Yes.
It's been described in dozens of articles. In a nutshell, it's more confrontational.
Much more hawkish.
Less engagement, more
It's
confrontation.
Peter Navarro, it's Michael Pillsbury.
Pillsbury's very influential.
I was just with him a week ago. I mean, clearly he believes that China's going to take over the world, and they mean to take it from us, right? That's
Zero sum.
Very zero sum.
So
and trade is the non-zero sum piece of the U.S.-China relationship right now, though it's becoming more zero sum if you believe that supply chains are becoming shorter. With the post-industrial, fourth industrial revolution, if you don't need capital, and if you don't need labor for capital, and Chinese labor is getting more expensive, then why would you build all of your stuff in China? So I can even imagine that the U.S.-China trade relationship is going to become somewhat more zero sum than it has been. But in technology, where the Chinese are developing their own tech standards, tech companies that are separate from ours, zero sum. Defense, obviously, zero sum, security dilemma.
Yep.
Increasingly, architecture. We thought the Chinese were going to align with our architecture, the IMF and the World Bank, and instead they start building their own, becoming more zero sum. So the major aspects of Chinese and American power that interact with each other are becoming more zero sum. And we know that the way you avoid conflict is by interdependency, is by being too big to fail, by people needing you, right?
That's
how
the
you
liberal
avoid.
idea, right?
That's, well, I mean, it's not just the liberal idea. I mean, realpolitik people understand that. It's also interdependence theory. It's both.
Right.
But no matter how you look at it ideologically, whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing that U.S. is becoming more confrontational towards China and the Chinese are becoming more assertive globally, it is clear that the relationship overall, and it's the most important relationship in the world, is heading towards confrontation. And the announcements coming in the next couple of months, which will be positive, should fool nobody.
I'm suspecting it might be a little bit superficial. So getting to risk number one, bad seeds, as we alluded to at the beginning. Your report says the wide array of issues we follow at the Eurasia Group, more than 90% of them are now headed in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
What are those seeds and who planted them?
Well, I mean, they've been planted for a long time, but if you think about it, you look at all the major international relations in the world. So U.S.-Russia, U.S.-China, U.S.-Europe, U.S.-Canada, U.S.-Mexico, intra-Middle East, intra-Europe. All of those international relations are trending in a more confrontational, less sustainable way. That's number one. Then number two is the fact that inside democracies, with the notable exception of Japan, you have this significant erosion of leadership, legitimacy, weakening of institutions, and polarization. You and I have never seen an environment like that. So those are the bad seeds that are being planted. And they're being planted for very different reasons, and I talk about some of that in my book, none of which have urgency, none of which require us to respond to them now, especially because the United States is more insulated, right? We are the one country that can do the most to respond to these challenges, and yet we are one of the most insulated from them in the near term, right? I mean, our geopolitical environment in the Western Hemisphere is very stable. There's no local arms race. We don't have refugees coming over. We just don't have, we are the largest oil producer. We're the largest food producer. I mean, we're just not going to feel it. Particularly powerful Americans are just not going to feel it. So as a consequence, the lead risk for 2019, I mean, it is possible that we could have some massive sudden shock in 2019 that none of us are expecting, like a cyber attack, for example, and we really fail. So 2019 could be the year the world is suddenly like before and after, right? Where were you when? I don't think that is true, but I clearly see that I think it would be irresponsible of us to talk about top risks for 2019 and take a blinkered view on that, not recognize that over the course of this year, the bad seeds that we are going to continue to plant are going to yield a very bitter harvest over the course of the next few years.
Well, unfortunately, we have to wrap up pretty soon because we're going to continue your debate with Tom Nichols from this morning,
Which will be a lot of fun.
on Morning Joe, right? And also CNN is waiting right out the door there to interview you between those these two events. So just to wrap up, can you, and you're welcome to say no, but can you describe, sort of a political science perspective of the world today, international system, where all the elements you described today actually can maintain somewhat of a stable peace, like something like in the late 1800s or something like that? Or is that just completely far-fetched?
Look, I think that for the near future, the best we can hope for are responsible and accountable actors inside the system, recognizing that it's getting worse, playing defense. The Germanys, the Canadas, the Japans, individual mayors, governors, CEOs, doing what they can to build resilience while the global system unwinds. Like, this is not the right time to say, what is the next system?
Right.
Because we're not, that is not where we're heading. We're not heading in the next 1, 2, 3 years towards building the next system. We're heading to the unwind. And in that environment, right? You need to kind of say, what can we do to make sure that this doesn't get much worse, right? That should be the focus.
Ian, thank you so much
My
for
pleasure,
coming
man.
by,
Good
and
to
I'll
see you.
see you again next year, I hope.
Yes, you will. Absolutely.
Thank you.
God willing. I said that when it was New Year's. I'm like, and for the